Welcome back to the desk, guys. This is episode 2 of my tips and tricks series, and in this particular video I'm going to be talking about the basics of airbrushing. So how I prep the parts, how I hold the parts, and then I'm going to go into the basic airbrushing techniques for both watercolor and oil-based paints, as well as kind of how to clean up the airbrush after you use it. I guess the best way to preface this is that this is how I do things with my particular airbrush setup. So depending on what your airbrush has and whatnot, it'll be different. So if you're already into air modeling and your airbrush and you have your own system, by all means don't take this as the gospel, and you don't have to switch things over to my way of doing it. But if you're new to this, or if you're finding you're having issues with your setup or your technique, give mine a shot and see if it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. If it does, it does. And yeah, this is just how I do things, and that's how it works. So let's swing you guys around, and you can take a quick look at the prep work that goes into it. And as always, my name is Sean, and this is Sean's Aviation. Okay, so part of this video you're going to see I actually filmed a few weeks ago while I was painting the cockpit parts here and some of the detail parts for the Focke-Wulf 190 A8. So this was all filmed a few weeks ago, but I'm just going to do the intro now. So what you're going to notice when you see the video, which I didn't talk about before, which is why I'm doing this now, is the way that I hold my parts. I used to have a foam styrofoam block and some toothpicks, and I would use this stuff here. It's the sticky stuff for posters, sticky tack. You know, you gum a little bit off, you stick it to the back of your poster, stick it to the wall, and then you can pull the poster off without damaging the wall or the paper. So it's a no tape way of hanging posters. And I found this worked really well. If you take a little kind of a goopy piece at the back, you could stick it to your part. I don't have a toothpick handy right now, I'll just use, say, a file, but you would stick it to the toothpick and you would stick that into the foam, and it gave you a way of painting the part without actually having to touch it with your fingers and protect it. So you can paint one side. I would usually paint both sides, get a little bit in around the sticky part, and then once it was dry, you know, you just pop this off, put it on the other side, and you'd have a little bit of an area here where the sticky part was. You could just touch that up with a second coat of paint, and you'd have the entire thing painted. So I was using that for the longest time, but unfortunately over time this stuff loses its tackiness because it gets coated in paint. You can't clean it. So what I would basically do is kind of, you know, stretch and fold, but all you're doing is just breaking the paint down. Some of it falls off, but some of it gets embedded into this, and it loses its stickiness over time. So it wasn't the best long-term solution. So I followed that for, I don't know, a year or two. And then I moved on to a better idea. So I found these on Amazon from China for like $4.99. They're little alligator clips. Little tiny alligator clips on a metal rod. They're actually designed to hold photos. These are those arts and craft jobbies where you see them, you know, on a base, whether it's a little wooden block or, you know, a toy or what have you, you know, for weddings or for anniversaries or birthday parties or whatever. You would get something like a teddy bear or a little ceramic elephant and drill a hole and glue this in and put your pictures on it, and that way you have, you know, a theme picture holder on every table to hold table numbers or pictures if you want to make a montage or whatever. So that's what these are. That's what these are designed for. But they work great for holding little model bits. So I started off by grabbing some excess MDF I had laying around the shop, glued it together. I shouldn't say glued it together. I nailed it together with my brad nailer. Gave it a quick shot with some Monogram flat black spray paint just to give it a bit of look. You can already see I got some overspray on. I don't care if this gets ruined, it's just some MDF. I can paint it black later, not a big deal. I then drilled holes roughly the same size as the wires. So you take your little clip, you clip your part on, and then you stick it on the block. just like that. And then what you do is when you're actually painting, which you'll see when I do it, pull it off the block, paint your part, usually away from here, and then you can put it back. And that way it sits, it has a way to dry, and you can hold on to it easily. You're spraying out here, you're not getting overspray onto your fingers, you're not touching the part. Definitely the best way I have found to hold parts while you're painting. So yeah, that is how I do that. So let's jump over and I guess jump back, and you can see some of the clips of how I do the painting. Stay tuned. So here you can see the basic paint setup I have. It's a booth. It's a little hard to see everything, but it's a 5-sided cube basically with this end open so I can access it. Over here I have a number of tools that are handy. Actually, you know what, here I'll just pick you guys up and give you a quick walk around of what it looks like. So this is the paint booth. On this side, as I said, I have some of the tools I need. Quick-handed, I got my airbrush lube, a pair of tweezers in case I got to pick anything up, some cleaning bits. I use the little nails to stir paint, pliers, some more cleaning bits, the little wrenches, the pipettes in order to grab paint thinners and whatnot. I have some primers over here. I have a selection of the Testors spray cans. I don't use them very often. You never know when you're going to come in handy, so I keep them around. And then I've got my Alclad lacquer thinner, and I've got my gloss and flat coats ready to go. I have the main area that I use to paint. I've got masking tape here. I got quick pieces. These are the pieces I kind of grab in a pinch to do some general masking. And then over here I've got my airbrush cleaner and the area where my airbrush hangs. Down underneath the booth, which is a little dark, you're not going to see, I have a compressor. Sorry, that's where I was able to run the brush from. And then over here I have a special pipette I've marked with tape, which I use for water, for when I do the water-based paints. That way I don't mix up the water and oils. I do use the same airbrush for both water and oil, which is not necessarily recommended, but I never went out and bought a second airbrush for the water. So I use both. I just make sure that it has a good solid dry in between uses. So this is the airbrush I am using. It is the Iwata Eclipse HPCS. So it's a double action. Whoops. I'll fix you guys here. There we go. So it's a double action airbrush. Double action airbrushes give you the ability to push up and down for the airflow, and then back and forth to adjust the paint flow. So you can control how much air you have coming out, and you can control how much paint is coming out, all in one finger. So it gives you a bit more control over the painting. It takes a bit of practice to get used to, but I recommend everybody uses a double action for most of their painting needs. Today I'm going to be using the Vallejo Model Air. Recently been switching over to this just as it keeps the smell down. I never managed to get a fan installed in here. It was a plan in the long run to have an exhaust fan and a filter installed, and I never got around to it. And now that there are children in the house, I tend to limit the painting to times when they're gone, just to keep the amount of fumes and whatnot in the air to a minimum. This Vallejo Model Air, being water-based, it isn't nearly as I wouldn't say it's not harmful, but it is very nearly non-harmful when you compare it to other paints. The level of harm you will get from the fumes are very, very slim. So with the door closed, the fact I'm in the basement, close the door, you know, what will manage to make it upstairs is definitely better than what I would be doing under an oil-based paint. So I've been switching over to these. Great color range. Prices are relatively similar to what I'll be paying for the Model Master paints. The one thing I do like about these, the Model Air series, is they're pre-formulated for airbrushing. There's no thinning required. So I can just drop a few drops in the airbrush if I need to paint one tiny bit. I'm not messing around with trying to get proper mixing, which I'll show you a little later. in the series here, I'll do some painting with the Model Master paints, and you can see the work that goes into making sure that everything is pre-thinned. So as you can see, I've been shaking it. You want to give everything a good shake, make sure that any of the pigment has been mixed properly. You'll see the Model Air, the tip, it's just a little kind of nipple tip, I guess you want to call it. So with the airbrush, a few drops. I always paint set the air pressure to a 15 psi. Give it a few tests. See how it looks coming out. So it's a nice smooth painting action there. It's already preset, so I don't have to worry. If I was going to do some fine lines, I would thin it a little bit. You want a slightly thinner consistency, the thinner the line goes. But for what I'm doing, it's fine. So as you see, I have my block. I have these alligator clips on wires. They're designed to hold pictures from those, picture holder craft art things. But in this case, it's going to hold the pieces. When you paint, you always want to start your painting, go past your item, and then stop painting, and then go back and repeat the procedure. And you want to overlap your lines about 50%. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here so you guys get a good view of what's going on. Right, so there's my piece. Right, and just like that, you've got your first coat. First coat's painted. That's all you really want to do in your first coat. You don't want to lay it on too thick. Give it a nice thin layer, and you can always go back and add more later. So instrument panel, same thing. In the case of the instrument panel with that overhang, tilt the item so that the overhang is in the direction you're painting, so you can easily hit that overhang. You can always throw it upside down and give it another quick coat to get all the edges. I will eventually swap this around. Once it dries, move the clip to another location and make sure I can paint underneath where the clip is. An item like this, a long skinny item, you can see you can just slowly rotate it in your fingers as you're doing your brushing so that you can hit all corners. As long as you're giving it thin layers, you're not going to overpaint anything. Same with the seat here. Kind of rotate it with your fingers as you're painting and you get a nice overall coverage. Last piece is, for now, will be the armor bulkhead behind the pilot. Get both sides of that and then get the edges. Let it dry. Give myself a tad more paint. I always prefer to wipe the tips off. I don't know whether this stuff will actually ever dry into a clog, but better off to not take a chance. So finally, I have the cockpit tub itself. It's a bit of a complicated shape, as you saw before. I've got the instrument panel, the control stick and the rudder pedals in, but just some nice, small, thin. Kind of hit it from all these different directions. Get a little bit on the outside just in case. Better safe than sorry. So that's a good base on that. So we're gonna let this stuff dry. Give it a good solid, I would say at least half hour before you do anything to it. Even longer if you're gonna do any type of masking or anything on it. But you can easily see how just in a couple of minutes that has a nice solid coat of the gray paint on it. And I would almost be happy with that even with just one coat. So I think when I come back, we'll take a look, see how things look, and if it stays like that, I will most likely just switch everything and do the second coat on the different angles. So stay tuned for that, and we'll show you some more in a bit. Okay, so we're back. I'm going to take the parts, flip them around. You'll now see where the clip was, left an unpainted tip, so we're going to have to go through and put that second coat, and the second coat will cover the tip. So flip that around, we'll go through and flip all of these around. As you're flipping them around, you want to take a quick look and make sure the place that you're putting the clip, the new location, is completely covered. You don't want to find a spot, for example, if there's a spot that has a little bit of a
missed spot, a bit of a light coat, you don't want to put the clip there. You want to put the clip on an area that has full coverage, so that, you know, the second coat can still catch any areas that need a little bit of a second coat. So again, I'm going to give myself just one more drop of paint here. And we'll give it a second coat. So once in a while, if you want to mix what's in the cup, the easiest way to do it is just use something to cover the end. And as you add air, you pull back slowly. I don't know if you can see, it'll actually bubble inside the cup. And that's the easiest way to just make sure what's in your cup has been mixed and isn't settling. If you set it for too long, the pigment will separate from whatever liquid or chemical you're using as the base. So you want to make sure that it's nice and mixed. You're not going to have any issues. So again, just nice nice thin coats. Make sure it has nice full coverage on it. And there we go. Everything has that second coat. So again, we'll just let everything sit for a little bit. Make sure it has all dries, and once it's dry, come back and take a look. Make sure there isn't any areas that are missing. You can touch up with a thin coat again if there are any small areas that are missing some paint. But that's basically it. If you are going to leave the airbrush for any length of time with paint in there, I recommend you use your cap. It just ensures that any of the chemicals that might off-gas when it's drying, it slows that process down. So you can let your airbrush sit for a little bit with the paint still in the cup, and it limits the amount of drying that will happen in there, especially with these water-based paints. They tend to dry with a film on the inside, and it's very hard to clean. So I recommend using the cap if you're going to leave it for any length of time. And on that note, we'll wait and see. If these things come out nice and dry, the next step I'll show you is how to clean the airbrush. The cleaning is the same whether it's water or oil based, so I'll show you how to clean the airbrush, and then after that we'll do some oil based paints, and we'll go from there. Okay, so I'm just finishing up some of the painting here. So one of the easiest things you can see is if, for example, this guy here, still wet, pick yourself up a cheap hairdryer. I got this for 10 bucks at a local discount store. So you're able to just, I'm not gonna, well, I'll do it quickly here, but basically turn it on, give everything a quick blow dry. It just helps, using the blow dryer just helps the paint dry a little bit faster. You still want to give it time to cure. You don't want to be touching it anytime soon. It just gives it a little bit of a, just to get the wetness off, helps get those chemicals to vapor off a little bit quicker. Because of all the other stuff I have, high power using turn. So yeah, it also just makes sure that while it's sitting here for any length of time, you're not going to get any dust build up in the on the wet paint. So it's always a good thing to have one of those kicking around. So now that we're done painting, it's time to clean this airbrush out. Using the water-based paint, the Vallejo Model Air, you can just use water. So I have a little cup of water here, just a little plastic Tupperware container, well, pipette that I have marked so it's only used for water. just fill it up a little bit here with some water. You also have the Iwata airbrush cleaning kit. So it's a little glass jar with the fitting on top. There's a little filter. It doesn't work the best, so you tend to spray stuff everywhere. But it does help contain what you have left over. With the water, I try not to put it in there because you get the water and oil mix and it eats up. So I usually just use paper towel or Kleenex for the water base. So add a bit of water, do the standard, plug the end, pull back on the air, get it to bubble. That just allows it to pick up any loose paint that's kicking around. Being water-based, I just usually spray it onto the Kleenex. The water will evaporate, the paint will stay on the Kleenex, and it just makes sure I don't mix that water in with the oil product in that container. So you want to drain all the water out. Now, as I mentioned before with the Vallejo, you'll see, if you can see inside, there's a film, a layer put in around the edge. That's a little tough to get out, so your best bet for that, grab a cleaner paper towel with a surface that's clean, or I use Kleenex usually. Stick it in, I just jam it in there, use your finger, and you kind of rub across the inside, and most of that will just peel right off. If you let it sit there for days and days and days, it's really hard to get off, but being only a few hours, it really isn't that hard right now. So again, pull back a little bit. Doing it this way, you tend to get the paint that sits down in the tip here, the bubbling action, the air comes out along here and comes out your tip. If you don't know how an airbrush works, I'd recommend looking. I could put a link in this video. I'll find a good explanation for how airbrushes work if you guys aren't 100% sure on the inner workings. But as the air comes out past the inner needle, it draws the paint out. So you get paint that sits down inside the inner workings in here. When you cover the end and pull back on the air has nowhere to go, so it forces itself back down the inside and then out into the paint cup, and that allows that air as it's coming back to clean out and pull a lot of that extra paint back into the water. So clean that out. I usually do it once or twice until I start to see I'll usually do it a few times until I start to see the water in the cup staying, or in the case of oil paint, the paint thinner, until I see it staying more or less clear, which means any of that loose paint that was in the front, it's already grabbed. So that there stayed more or less clear. So what I'll do is I'll dump that water back in, spray the last little bit out. Now you want to take your needle out. Your airbrush, depending on the manufacturer, will have different ways this works. In this case, it comes with a little wrench. You can just use that to loosen the tip. Tip spins off. There's your inner, I don't even know what you would call this piece, but there's an inner piece here that slides out. You can see on the tip the little hole that allows the air to come out with your needle sitting there. In this case here, I just have to loosen this little sort of nut at the back, loosen that off, and the needle will just slide right out. I always pull forwards out, never slide it back. The reason being, if you can see that, the needle is covered in paint and gunk. And if you pull that backwards through the airbrush, you're pulling all of that gunk back through the seal and through the back half of the airbrush where you should not have any paint. So you pull it forward. I usually set it aside, reassemble the airbrush. Well, actually at this point, you can get in here and clean inside this area here. That's a little harder to clean. And then also again, when you come down inside the paint cup, you're able to get lower down because that needle isn't there. And you can make sure that any residual paint that's sitting inside those corners all comes out. So there is a nice clean paint cup. So now you want to reassemble everything. Leave the needle out at this point. Just reassemble the tip. You always want to make sure you crank it down. Don't reef it tight, just a nice solid sort of hand tightening. Just ensures that that seal here stays tight and you don't have any air leakage. That'll cause bubbles and back pressure and some really nasty paint quality. So fill this in. Now you got to be careful because there's no needle. It'll just pour out the front a little bit. But not having the needle just ensures that any excess paint that's still sitting down that tip can be cleaned out with the water and the bubbles, just because that needle isn't making any contact with any internal surface. So again, a couple of bubbles, spray it out. That stayed nice and clean, so that's a good sign that everything had been cleaned out properly. This is the nice thing with water, is you can do this and there's no issues with any vapor or any bad chemicals that you're breathing in or anything. The needle, put your needle back in. When you do this, be very careful. It's very easy to damage the tip of the needle, and that will ruin the quality of the paint. So you always want to make sure that you keep that tip as clean as possible. Make sure it's down, seated as far forward as you can. Tighten the nut down, the back half of your airbrush back together. And now your airbrush has been reassembled. At this stage, I always give it another little bit. Add the water, or paint thinner. Give it some back pressure. Again, just make sure that the water or the paint thinner stays nice and clean. You're not getting any more gunk that the needles push through. In that case, it's clean. I can save it. And then you just make sure everything in the middle is cleaned out. You've sprayed out any leftover stuff, residual stuff. And now just let it sit. Being water, any water that's in there will eventually evaporate on its own. Same with paint thinner. The paint thinner will sort of flash off and you'll have a clean airbrush. In this case, if I am going to switch to oil, you want to give it a couple of hours. You don't want to immediately switch from water to oil back and forth. Give it some time in between paint types to clean itself out, for the water to evaporate, for the paint thinner to evaporate. Normally, if I am going to use oil for the very first time after a water usage, even if it's a week later, I put a bit of paint thinner, spray just a bit of paint thinner through there to clean the system out, make sure you're evacuating any water, and vice versa. If you've used oil the first time you use a water-based paint, just cycle some water through that, make sure that everything's nice and clean. So that is cleaning your airbrush. So the next step up we'll see is painting some oil-based paints. So stay tuned to that, and we'll continue this series. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to do the Model Master oil-based. So this is the Testors Model Master. It's their higher end brand of enamel oil-based paints. They also have a water-based acrylic line. These used to be the go-to paints for me. Great selection. I was used to them. I find the oil-based paints have great brushing coverage. So if you do any touch-ups or any detailing brushing by hand, they had the best coverage of all the paints that I've tried. Having a large selection made them the go-to paint. I wasn't a fan of Tamiya paints because you had a lot of mixing and ratios and stuff. There's just a lot of extra work when these had the colors. Unfortunately, recently Testors had been purchased by another company, and they started to discontinue a lot of the more niche colors, a lot of the specific militaries, a lot of the one-off military grays, the Russian militaries, some of the World War II specific colors, stuff that would only really be used in the small modeling sized paint bottle. They started to discontinue. So because of that, I've been switching over to, as I said before, the Vallejo. I'm going to be keeping some of this, like the whites, the blacks, the reds, the yellows, the common colors I'll probably keep in the oil, just in order to give me the ability to brush paint some of the details. But that being said, in this series, I'm going to show you how to do the oil-based painting. So it's very similar, the technique is similar to the water-based paints. You still want to give this a good shake ahead of time, make sure the paint is all mixed up. I have this nail. It's probably a 2-inch finish nail that I use. Just to give it a quick stir at the end. Make sure that there isn't any little bits of paint pigment gobbled up at the bottom. This is nice, and this is a brand new bottle of black, so I shouldn't have any issues with it. As you see, I always keep a good selection of paper towel kicking around, because that's why. It's actually Kleenex, I should say, but you wipe the part. The dirty one I put off to one side, so I have dirty on one side, clean on the other. That way I don't accidentally grab a dirty Kleenex and get wet paint all over my fingers. So you want to pour a little bit of black into here. Don't put as much as you would normally. Because I have to thin it down, you will get a little bit more volume. So yeah, don't put as much paint as you actually need, because as you add the paint thinner, it will add volume to what you have in there. So I just got my pipette of paint thinner. So if you take a look at when you do the bubble test, you put that on the end, pull back on the air, you see it bubbles. Right now it kind of bubbles like a tar pit. The air sort of comes out the top and it doesn't really bubble at all. So add a little bit of paint thinner. Your consistency you're looking for is milk. If you take a glass of water, say like a glass of molasses, and you blow bubble in a glass of molasses, it'll form a hole and the air will just escape out that one hole like a tar pit. If you think of water, when it blows bubbles in water, the bubbles just burst on the surface. If you blow bubbles in milk, the surface tension keeps the bubble, and the bubbles build and build and build and build and build and fill up the top of your cup. That's what you want to happen. As you pull back, this is also a way you can mix it, rotate it around, make sure the bubbles are coming out in all the area, so the surface area, and it allows that paint and thinner. You're using the air bubbles to mix the paint. So your final consistency, you can kind of see right now the bubbles are still bursting on the surface. So you add a little bit more, just a drop. Don't add too much. It's always, you can always add a little bit more paint thinner, but adding more paint is always more difficult. So you can kind of see there how the bubbles are building up on top of each other. That's sort of the consistency you want. So you can always give it a couple of test sprays, see what the coverage looks like. You want to see lots of coverage without a lot of clear through it. So that's a good, it's hard for you to tell right there, but that's a good coverage. So we'll start with that. We can always change the consistency as we go. The other thing I find, when you're done mixing everything with your bottle, take the paper towel, wipe the top surface of that jar. You want to wipe the threads. You get paint building up on those threads, and then you put the cap on, and then everything dries, and you end up having the paint cap either doesn't seal tightly, so you tighten it down, all that paint stops from having a good seal, and your paint will dry out, or the paint will dry and you'll never get the top off. You need to get a good pair of pliers or soak it under hot water to loosen the cap, and that's always a pain in the ass. So it's always good to keep your workspace as clean as you can get it. So we'll take the bits and we'll start spraying, and that's how you can also tell how good your mixing went. And that is a pretty good mix. It's a little on the watery side, but I can live with it. Once it dries, 2 coats, shouldn't have an issue. So as always, nice thin coats. You can always add more coats. It's easier to add more coats than try to strip apart. Nice thin coats. Again, spray at about 15 to 20 psi, somewhere in that range, depending on how good your compressor is. It's a little hard to get an exact number, so I always try to, somewhere between 15 and 20 is a good number. I got the wheels here for this guy here already masked, so a couple of coats of black on that. It's always tough with a complex shape like this, just because you have to rotate it around in so many different orientations to get all the surfaces covered, that it is very easy to build up too thick of a coat. So like I said, you're always err on the side of caution. Give it a couple of smaller coats. The one thing I also like about using these alligator clips is you're not worried about getting paint over them, so you can just kind of do what you need to do. So this is the engine for the HE162. Just giving the front half, actually the back half of this engine, a coat of black. It's supposed to be semi-gloss, but it's all going to be flat coated anyways when I'm done, so I mean, flat paint is fine. So that's that. First coat's on. I'm not going to go any more with the painting. You kind of get the idea of how you want to do painting. Short, well, not necessarily short, but you want to be able to, as you saw, start spraying, spray past the model, stop spraying. Don't start and stop the paint over the top of the item you're painting. Same skills as what I did with the water-based Vallejo paints. So you saw how to mix the paint. That's the key, is getting that right consistency. Always start with a little bit of paint thinner. If you think it's right, always err on the side of being a little too thick. Do a couple of test sprays, see how it comes out, add a bit more, add a bit more. And like I said, it's a lot easier to add a drop of paint thinner than to add paint, because as soon as you add some paint, it's going to be over thick and you have to keep adding paint thinner. So always kind of go a drop at a time. You will sort of get a gut feeling for it as you do your own. Just knowing kind of what that consistency should look like, because every paint cup is a different size. I'm guessing it's somewhere in the 2/3 paint to 1/3 paint thinner, but again, that all depends on kind of what paint you're using, what paint thinner you're using, all that other stuff. I'm just using a Canadian Tire brand, generic paint thinner, so it seems to work quite well. But again, whatever you find works best. So I'm going to leave this at this point. I'll come back to this video when it's time for me to clean the airbrush, and you'll be able to see. Again, it's very similar to how I cleaned with the water, but just so you can you get a feel for that. And then that should wrap up this how-to paint video. So stay tuned, and you'll see how to clean the airbrush. Okay, so here we are, all finished up painting with the flat black, and as you'll see, I don't know if you can see or not, I have a little bit of paint left in the cup. Unfortunately, I can't save it, because it has been thinned for the airbrush. If I mix it back in with the stock black over time, it will dilute that paint down. It will no longer be able to be brushed, and you're losing the quality of the paint. So unfortunately, one of the reasons why I prefer switching to the water-based paints that are pre-mixed, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about guessing how much paint you need and hoping to get it right. If there's too much, you can actually put that paint back in. If there's too little, add a bit more. In this case, if you mix too much, you're out of luck. You gotta get rid of it. So unfortunately, if you guess wrong and you have too much, you're completely out of luck. Your only option is to just dump and waste it. So luckily there's only a little bit left in here, so as you can kind of see with what I have here, I just spray it out. One of the reasons why I laid this newspaper down on top of the surface was I can just spray it out like that. You'll always get a little bit of drying on the outside of the ring, so I usually run a bead sort of around the edge, let the paint thinner flow down the sides. You don't want to put too much in here. I use the Iwata cleaning system, so if you put too much, you're just pressurizing the inside of this cleaning system. So you just literally put it in and just spray, and it's just going to spray that inside the tank. You might see a little bit of vapor coming out around the sides here. The filters don't fit perfect, but that's keeping the majority of your fumes and smells inside of this. But if you put too much inside the cup, you're over pressurizing the inside of that jar, and you will have leakage out the side, and then it just defeats the purpose. So just like the water-based, give it a spray, give the inside of that cup a good wipe. I don't know if you can see in there, you're always going to have a little bit of black paint sitting at the bottom. I usually run it about twice. Once to get the worst, and other ones, you know, move your airbrush around, make sure that the bubbles are getting every nook and cranny in there to pull as much of that paint out as possible. So that's about 90-odd, 99, 95% of what's in there. So that's close enough now that I can disassemble. So from here on out, other than really using the paint thinner and this system, cleaning is very similar to the water-based paint. You want to pull that, that needle out. Give the needle a good nice wipe down. Oh, like I said, try to stay away from the tip. Not only is it very easy to stab yourself, if you ruin the tip, the airbrush is pooched. If you want to get in there, I always just take this. You can twist the end of the Kleenex into a little point. You can put it in there. Just make sure that it's nice and clean in there. Reassemble the end. The other thing you can get, I got some of these micro brushes. I've never been a fan of painting with them, but I'll use that to get inside and clean along around that tip, just to make sure that it's nice and clean in there. Again, snug fit, just enough to compress that O-ring. Make sure there's no leakage. Add a bit of paint thinner without the pin. You got to be careful now when there's no pin. If you just push down on the button, it's full air. You can't control the airflow with the missing pin. So you just got to be very gentle at adding air. Just gentle, tiny little pushes. Don't go too much or it's just going to spray everywhere. You can already see how black that thinner got, so it's pulling out lots of paint from the nooks and crannies. So that's looking pretty good in there. So just one more kind of wipe down. You want to jam it in there. Make sure that you're right down to the bottom of the cup. Give it the little old spinaroo. That's looking really good. So now I'm going to reinstall the needle. Tighten that down. Put the back in. Give it another quick spray. One last little bit of paint thinner. Just to make sure that you're 100% clean in there. And that's looking perfectly clean. There's no discoloration to that that paint thinner at all. So you can put that back into that. Give it a lot of blowing. Make sure that it's nice and clean. There's nothing else residual inside of there. And that's it. That is the basics with airbrushing. I think that if anybody who has any interest in making models look as accurate as possible, as realistic as possible, airbrushing is the way to go. You'll never get, I shouldn't say never, it takes quite a bit of patience and skill in order to get a very accurate finish with a brush. I feel that the skill needed to use an airbrush is less than the skill to use a brush. If you want to get even a basic airbrushed aircraft, to match that with a brush takes a lot more skill. So it does take more skill to airbrush than it does to brush paint, but to brush as well as an airbrush takes a lot more. So I recommend getting an airbrush. You can get entry-level airbrushes. There are these, I don't know if you even get these anymore with Testors gone out of business the way they did, or being sold, but Testors made these simple airbrushes. They have interchangeable nozzles to get different thicknesses of tips. You know what, I can't remember what these are called off the top of my head. I will look up the name, and I will have the name for this this video when I'm finished. But they make a bunch of these ones. There's basics all the way up to more of advanced versions of these. Aztec, there we go. Testors Aztec brushes. They come in kits, and as I said, you can go anywhere from a really, this is one of the more basic models, to a very expensive model. You can even see how this has an attachment. It actually comes with a compressed air can, and it runs off the compressed air can versus being plugged into a compressor. It does come with an adapter. You can buy adapters to run these on compressors, but you can even run them off compressed air if you want to save money and only use it once in a while. So everything from something like that right up to a multi, $400, $500, $600 airbrush. This one here, you're looking at $200. So it's nothing crazy. I mean, a long-term investment. I've had this guy here for probably 5 or 6 years now. It's paid for itself many times over in terms of how good the paint is. So I definitely recommend for anybody who wants to have a clean-looking, finished job, invest in an airbrush. Yeah, if there is any questions or comments on airbrushing, I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert at this. I'm sure a lot of you out there are screaming and pulling their hair out because I did everything wrong, but that's how I do it. As I said, if you have any questions or comments, by all means, please leave them at the bottom. And that is the end of this video. Stay tuned for some more tips and tricks, and as always, check out my other videos I have on my YouTube channel. We will see you all later.
Thank you for watching, guys, and as always, if you are interested in any of the content you see, you can access my website at www.seans-aviation.com. You can see all the latest pictures of aircraft and museums and the build logs of all of my current models and past models on that site. And if you're interested in any of this content, please click the subscribe button here on YouTube to follow more. Thank you very much, and see you guys next time.